Good day, everyone. Seth Naeve here, and I'm just filming a little backup copy. I had trouble on my strategic farming Let's Talk Crops session this morning on soybean variety selection, so I just want to take a few minutes, record a session so that for those of you that weren't able to catch it, you'll be able to download and do it here. Made a lot of comments about this in the session, so I'm not going to go into much detail here, but there's a lot of overarching factors that are important in variety selection, as well as some very detailed things. And again, this was all covered pretty much in depth during the session, so please review the recording of the Zoom session if you'd like some more detail on any of these comments. But I would want to talk a little bit about the Minnesota variety trials summary, looking at traits. And so we're going to talk about Minnesota variety trials here. So I have 3 slides that look at different trait packages, herbicide trait packages relative to each other. So these are kind of head-to-heads of all of the varieties entered into the Minnesota variety trials or any other varieties that were otherwise tested in the program in these first 3 slides. So what we're seeing here is Roundup Extends versus GT27s. The numbers at the top represent the number of tests. So this is locations, replicated yield trials in each of these years. So you can see in 18 there were 6 actual trials where Aaron Lorenz's group was able to compare at least one Roundup to Extend versus a GT27. And in most cases there was many head-to-head comparisons. 15 and 19, 14 and 20, and then for a total of 35 total comparisons across those 3 years. The air bars here represent the LSD at a 95% confidence interval. So what we're looking at is really a comparison of all the Extend varieties versus all the GT27s entered into the Minnesota variety trials in 3 years, and whether they're significantly different or not across all of those. You can see they're at that very conservative and stringent statistical significance level. There was not a significant difference. But for the argument here, you can see that the GT27s actually produced a couple bushel yield extra relative to those varieties, the Extend varieties in these trials. Likewise, if we look at the Extends versus the E3s, this is what we saw. So again, a little bit newer trait coming on the marketplace. So fewer comparisons in 19, many more in 20. And again, the E3s probably suffered just a couple bushels. So these are, again, important to note that these are the pool of varieties that were entered into the Minnesota variety trials that were either Extend or E3s. Compared within those years. So this isn't all the varieties available. These are the varieties primarily that were entered into the trial. And then if you look at the GT27s versus the E3s, they actually look quite good relative to the others. So again, probably about a 3 bushel yield difference across those years for the GT27s versus the E3s. Now, something completely different, we're looking at the first trials. So I have access to the data from the first trials. I don't have the variety names, but I have all of the yields for all of the varieties entered in each of the zones. So shown here is the variety yields, average yields for that particular zone within the first trials. So this includes those varieties that were in the bottom yielding group that were discarded, usually about 30 of those varieties, shown in a box plot. So this is the average yield of individual varieties. No statistical analysis here. It just shows you basically the mean, the 75th and 25th percentile of those individual mean yields, as well as any outliers. You can see there's only 4 conventionals, 2 Roundup 2s, 32 Roundup Extends, 47 E3s, and 11 GT27s entered into the southern Minnesota first trials in 2020. Okay, so again, no statistical analysis, but you can see differences in mean yields across those groups. And we're looking at the E3s are down, they're down a good 3 or 4 bushels relative to the Extends and the GT27s in this particular zone. If we look at the South Central first variety trials, there's a little bit more parity. You'll notice on the x-axis we've really stretched things out because the 8 conventional varieties had a big range between, from 50 to 75 bushels. So that really stretched our axis, so it really minimizes the differences that we see in these box plots, but you'll still see a good 10 or 15 yield variation in yields within each of those trait classes. And you'll see slight differences in the mean yields, but really overall relatively little. And in fact, if you chose any of those individual varieties, basically, if you're selecting varieties within any of these classes, you're equally likely to select a variety at that same yield level in another one of these trait packages. So mean yields of those groups versus the top and the bottom is another thing for somebody certainly to look at. The Extend varieties certainly had a few varieties that yielded greater than the top yields in the E3s and the GT27s, and you'll notice that the E3s had a few varieties that yielded lower. So those are certainly ones to either avoid or ones to key in on. And if we look at the southeast zone for the first trials, here's how those lined up. We didn't have any conventionals, just 2 Roundup 2s. Again, 30 Extends, 47 E3s, and 11 GT27. So again, very close yield parity within a couple bushels on average. And here you'll notice we had a couple E3s that actually yielded 4 or 5 bushels better than some of the best Extends, but we also had some of the lowest yields within that group as well. And lastly, the Minnesota North Central. I'm going to end this here. I think we've gone far enough north for us at this point, but this is the North Central zone, and you'll see that we had pretty much yield parity across all 3 of those classes. So with that, I thank you, and I appreciate your attention, and I apologize for not being able to present these slides earlier. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.